New York City in the autumn of 1873 wore its wealth like a woman wears jewelry, too much, too bright, and always positioned where the light would catch it just right. The brownstone mansions along Fifth Avenue stood shoulder to shoulder, their facades gleaming in the amber light of late afternoon, each one a monument to the fortunes built on railroads and steel, on cotton and coal, on the restless expansion that had turned a young nation into an empire. Inside the Whitmore mansion, the chandeliers burned even in daylight. Crystal droplets caught the sun and scattered it across walls papered in silk, imported from France. The carpet beneath Cordelia Ashford's feet was so thick, her footsteps made no sound. She had learned over 3 years of marriage to move through these rooms like a ghost, quiet, unobtrusive. Present but not demanding presence, she stood now at the edge of the grand parlor, watching the other women arrange themselves on velvet settees like exotic birds on gilded perches. Their dresses rustled with each small movement. Taffeta and silk emerald and sapphire cream and rose. The afternoon light streaming through the tall windows turned them into living paintings, perfectly composed, perfectly still, except for the delicate motion of teacups rising to lips, painted the acceptable shade of not quite red. None of them looked at Cordelia directly. They never did. She knew what they saw when they glanced her way, and then quickly elsewhere. A tall woman, taller than fashion permitted, 31 years old, which in their circles meant the bloom was already fading. Hair the color of old mahogany pulled back in a style severe enough to suggest she had given up trying to soften what could not be softened. Eyes the shade of amber held up to sunlight, unusual enough to be remarked upon if anyone cared to remark, and running from just below her right eye down to the corner of her jaw. Impossible to miss, impossible to ignore, impossible to pretend away. A birthmark the color of wine left too long in the glass. Port wine, the doctors called it with their clinical precision. Cordelia called it nothing. It was part of her face the same way her nose was part of her face. She had stopped apologizing for it somewhere around her 12th birthday. New York society had not. Lavinia Whitmore moved through the parlor with the grace of a woman who had spent 62 years learning exactly how much space she was permitted to occupy, and then taking slightly more. Her hair, pure white now, was arranged in an elaborate construction of braids and curls that must have taken her maid 2 hours to achieve. She wore ice blue silk, pearls at her throat, 3 strands, each one larger than the last. On her left hand, a cameo ring that had belonged to her grandmother. She stopped beside Cordelia with the precision of a general choosing ground. "My dear," she said, her voice pitched low enough that only Cordelia would hear. "You look so terribly pale. Are you quite well?" The words were solicitous. The eyes were not. Lavinia Whitmore's eyes were the color of coal and just as hard. When she looked at Cordelia, she was not seeing a niece by marriage. She was seeing a problem that had not yet been solved, but would be given time and the proper application of pressure. "I am well, Aunt Lavinia. Thank you for your concern. Augustus would want you to rest more. You push yourself so." Augustus, Cordelia's husband, 53 years old to her 31. A man who had married her 3 years ago with the careful enthusiasm of someone acquiring a painting he quite liked, but did not love. He had been kind in his way, distant but kind. The marriage had been arranged by Lavinia, who managed the Ashford family affairs with the same iron control she applied to everything else in her orbit. Augustus had needed a wife. Cordelia had needed the security of a name and a household. It was by the standards of their world a perfectly reasonable transaction. Augustus is resting now, Cordelia said. The doctor says his heart is improving. This was a lie, and both women knew it. Augustus Ashford's heart was not improving. It was failing with the slow inevitability of a ship taking on water, one leak at a time. The doctors came twice a week now instead of once. They spoke in hushed tones in the hallway outside his bedroom. They left medicines that did nothing and instructions that changed daily because nothing was working. Lavinia's expression did not change. Yes, the doctor. How fortunate we are to have such excellent care. She moved away, then back into the current of conversation flowing through the parlor. Cordelia watched her go. Watched the way the other women straightened slightly when Lavinia approached. Watched the way space was made for her without anyone seeming to move. Power, Cordelia thought, looked like that. Like not having to ask for anything because everything was already being offered. She left the parlor without saying goodbye to anyone. No one noticed. Or if they did, they gave no sign. The Ashford townhouse was 4 blocks away, close enough that Cordelia walked rather than calling for a carriage. The October air was sharp with the promise of winter. Leaves the color of rust and copper tumbled down the streets. The city smelled of coal smoke and roasting chestnuts of horses and the particular dampness that comes just before the season turns. Cordelia pulled her shawl tighter and walked faster. She found Augustus in his bedroom propped up on pillows, staring out the window at nothing in particular. He had been handsome once. You could still see it in the bones of his face, in the line of his jaw. But illness had stripped away the flesh, leaving behind something gaunt and gray. He turned his head when she entered, smiled or tried to. Cordelia, how was your afternoon with the vultures? They are not vultures, Augustus. They are simply women with too much time and too little purpose. That is what vultures are. He coughed a wet, rattling sound that made Cordelia reach for the glass of water on the bedside table. He waved it away. Sit. Tell me something interesting. Anything. I am dying of boredom almost as quickly as I am dying of this damned heart. She sat in the chair beside his bed. The same chair she had occupied every evening for 3 years. There is nothing interesting to tell. It was the same as always. Then tell me something that is not interesting. I will take anything over the sound of my own breathing. So she told him about the new curtains Mrs. Vanderbilt had ordered, about the scandal of the youngest Astor girl being seen unchaperoned with a clerk from her father's firm, about the menu for the upcoming Whitmore ball, which would feature oysters from Long Island and wine from France, and some elaborate ice sculpture shaped like a swan. Augustus listened or pretended to. His eyes drifted closed, opened again, closed. Lavinia asked about you, Cordelia said quietly. Of course she did. She asks about me constantly. She is waiting. Waiting for what? For me to die, my dear. Do not look shocked. We both know it. She has been managing my affairs since I became too ill to manage them myself. Once I am gone, she will manage them completely. Unless... He stopped, opened his eyes, looked at her with something that might have been regret. Unless, what, Augustus? Unless you give me a son. The words sat between them like a third person in the room. Cordelia felt something cold settle in her chest. Augustus, we have discussed this. The doctors said it was unlikely. My constitution, they said. The difficulty of my temperament. The doctors are idiots. Your constitution is fine. Your temperament is the only thing about you that is not boring. He reached out, took her hand. His fingers were thin and cold. I should have done better by you, Cordelia. I should have been a better husband. A younger one, at least. You have been kind. Kind is what you are to servants. I should have been more. He coughed again. Lavinia wants you gone. You know this, yes. Cordelia said nothing. She had known it from the first day she entered this house. Lavinia Whitmore did not want a young woman with ideas of her own anywhere near the Ashford fortune. If there is a child, Augustus continued, you would have a claim. Protection. Without one. He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. That night, Cordelia lay beside her dying husband in the darkness and listened to him struggle for breath. Outside, the city breathed more easily. Carriages rattled past. Somewhere, a dog barked. The sounds of a world that did not care whether Augustus Ashford lived or died, whether Cordelia Ashford had a place in it or not. She placed her hand on her stomach, so flat, so empty. The doctors had been clear. 3 years of marriage, no children. It was not Augustus's fault. It was hers. Her body, they said with their careful professional distance, was not suited for childbearing. Some women were made for it. Others were not. Cordelia had accepted this the way she had accepted the birthmark on her face, as a fact of her existence that could not be changed and therefore must be endured. But now, lying in the dark, listening to death come slowly for the man beside her, she wondered if acceptance had been wisdom or simply cowardice. Augustus died 3 weeks later on a Tuesday morning just after dawn. Cordelia was with him at the end. He opened his eyes, looked at her with something that might have been recognition, or might have been only the random firing of a brain losing oxygen. And then he was gone. The silence after was enormous. Cordelia sat beside the body for nearly an hour before she stood and rang for the servants. She should have been crying. She knew that. The proper response to widowhood was tears, but her eyes remained dry. She felt something that was not quite grief and not quite relief. She felt more than anything alone. The funeral was held 4 days later at Trinity Church. Every pew was filled. The city's most prominent families came to pay their respects to one of their own. They looked at Cordelia in her black mourning dress and her black veil, and they whispered. She could not hear the words, but she knew what they were saying. Poor woman. No children. What will become of her now? Lavinia Whitmore sat in the front pew beside Cordelia, dressed in black silk that probably cost more than most families earned in a year. She did not cry either. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, her back straight, her expression composed. To anyone watching, she was the picture of dignified grief. Only Cordelia saw the small smile that touched the corner of her mouth when the coffin was lowered into the ground. The reading of the will took place 1 week later, in the office of Harrison and Sons attorneys at law. The office smelled of old paper and pipe tobacco. Rain drummed against the windows. November had arrived cold and wet. Cordelia sat in a leather chair that was too large for her and listened to Harrison Sr. read through the legal language that transformed a life into assets and liabilities. The townhouse, the summer home in Newport, the shares in various railroad companies, the investments, the accounts. All of it, every single piece, placed under the management and control of Mrs. Lavinia Whitmore, until such time as Mrs. Cordelia Ashford could demonstrate suitable capacity for the responsibility. Cordelia felt the floor disappear beneath her feet. "I beg your pardon," she said, her voice cutting through Harrison's monotone. "Demonstrate suitable capacity. What does that mean?" Harrison looked uncomfortable. He was 60 years old and had been managing Ashford family legal affairs for 3 decades. He had known Augustus since the man was a boy. "It means, Mrs. Ashford, that Mrs. Whitmore will oversee the estate until you have shown yourself capable of managing your own affairs. I am 31 years old. I managed my father's household for 5 years before his death. I have managed my own household for 3 years of marriage. What further demonstration is required?" Lavinia spoke for the first time, her voice calm as deep water. "My dear Cordelia, this is not a reflection on your character. Augustus was concerned. He wanted to ensure you were protected. A woman alone without the guidance of a husband, without the wisdom that comes with age. He wanted only to keep you safe by placing me under your control, by ensuring you were cared for." Cordelia turned back to Harrison. "When was this will drawn up?" Harrison consulted his papers. 2 months ago, August of this year. 2 months ago, when Augustus was barely conscious more than a few hours a day, when the laudanum he took for pain left him confused and disoriented, when Lavinia was at his bedside, constantly always present, always helpful. Was Augustus in sound mind when he signed this? Harrison's discomfort deepened. He was attended by his physician who certified his capacity. Which physician? Dr. Morrison. Dr. Morrison, Lavinia's personal physician, a man who owed his position in society to the Whitmore family patronage. Cordelia looked at Lavinia. Lavinia looked back. In that moment, Cordelia understood completely. The will was a lie. Or if not a lie, then a manipulation so complete it might as well be. Augustus had been dying and drugged and desperate, and Lavinia had been there with papers to sign and assurances that it was all for Cordelia's protection. "I see," Cordelia said quietly. "There is one more item," Harrison said, clearly eager to move past the tension in the room. "A provision has been made for Mrs. Cordelia Ashford to reside at the Ashford estate in Montana Territory for a period of recuperation and rest. The property is fully staffed and prepared to receive her. Mrs. Whitmore believes the mountain air would be beneficial after such a terrible loss." Montana Territory. Cordelia had never been west of Philadelphia. Montana was not civilization. It was wilderness. A place where the railroad barely reached, where towns were rough collections of wooden buildings, and the nearest neighbor might be 50 miles away. "I have no wish to go to Montana," Cordelia said. "It is not a matter of wish," Lavinia said gently, so very gently. "It is what Augustus wanted for you. Time away from the city, away from the memories. A chance to heal." "A chance to be forgotten, you mean?" Lavinia's expression did not change. "My dear, you are distraught. Grief is making you say things you do not mean. The estate in Montana is beautiful, peaceful. You will have time to recover yourself, to find your strength again." Cordelia looked at Harrison. "Am I legally required to go?" Harrison looked down at his papers, said nothing, which was answer enough. "I see," Cordelia said again. She stood. The room tilted slightly. She gripped the back of the chair until the vertigo passed. "When am I expected to depart?" "A week from today," Lavinia said. "I have taken the liberty of making the arrangements. The train will take you as far as Helena. From there, a coach will bring you to the estate. It is 3 days' journey, but you will be comfortable. I have insured it." Of course she had. Lavinia had insured everything. Cordelia walked out of Harrison's office into the rain. She had no umbrella. Within minutes, she was soaked through. She walked anyway. Walked until her shoes were ruined and her dress was plastered to her skin, and she could no longer tell if the water on her face was rain or tears. She ended up at the townhouse. Her townhouse. Except it was not hers anymore. Nothing was hers. She climbed the steps, dripping water onto the marble floor. The butler looked alarmed. "Mrs. Ashford, you are drenched. Let me send for—" "I am fine, Morrison. Thank you." She went upstairs to the bedroom she had shared with Augustus. His clothes still hung in the wardrobe. His books still sat on the nightstand. She could smell his cologne, faint but present as if he had just left the room. She sat on the edge of the bed and put her head in her hands. Montana. They were sending her to Montana. As far from New York as they could send her without actually putting her on a ship to Europe. Far enough that she would be forgotten. Far enough that whatever happened to her there, no one would know. And no one would care. Lavinia had played her hand perfectly. The will was probably legal enough to survive any challenge Cordelia could mount. The probate court would side with a respected society matron over a childless widow with a birthmark. And even if Cordelia won, what would she win? The right to fight Lavinia for every penny, every decision, every small scrap of autonomy for years to come. Or she could go to Montana, accept exile, disappear. Cordelia stood and walked to the window. Rain streaked the glass. Beyond the city, spread out in all directions. All those buildings full of all those people living all those lives that had nothing to do with her. She placed her hand on her stomach again. Still flat. Still empty. Or was it? She had been tired lately. More tired than grief alone would explain. Her courses, usually precise, had been late. Not much. A few days. But late. Cordelia stood very still. It was impossible. The doctors had been clear. 3 years of trying had produced nothing. Why would now be different? But bodies did not follow schedules. Babies came when they came. And if there was a child, even the possibility of a child, then everything changed. A child would give her a claim to the Ashford estate that Lavinia could not contest. An heir would make Cordelia necessary instead of inconvenient, unless Cordelia's mind moved through the possibilities like a chess player, considering the board. If she told Lavinia now, Lavinia would keep her in New York, keep her close, monitor her, control her. The pregnancy would be difficult, the doctors would say. Best to rest. Best to avoid excitement. Best to sign these papers, make these decisions, trust these arrangements. And if she lost the baby, as so many women did, then she would be right back where she started. Except worse, because then Lavinia would know that Cordelia had tried to use pregnancy as leverage and failed. No. If there was a child, if there was even the possibility of a child, Cordelia could not let Lavinia know. Not yet. Not until it was too late for Lavinia to do anything about it. She would go to Montana. She would let them think they had won. And in the wilderness, far from Lavinia's eyes, she would find out if the impossible had become possible. And if it had, she would use that knowledge like the weapon it was. The train left New York on a Wednesday morning in late November. Cordelia brought 2 trunks, a carpet bag, and a crate of books. Lavinia came to see her off. They stood on the platform while porters loaded luggage and conductors shouted schedules. "Write to me," Lavinia said. "Let me know how you are settling in." "Of course, Aunt Lavinia. The estate manager is a man named William Grant. He has been with the family for 20 years. You can trust him." Trust him to report everything back to you, Cordelia thought. I am sure he is very capable. Lavinia touched Cordelia's arm. To anyone watching, it would look like affection. "This is for the best, my dear. You will see. Some time away from all of this." She gestured vaguely at the city, at the station, at everything. "It will give you clarity. I am certain it will." The conductor called for final boarding. Cordelia stepped up into the train car, found her seat. The window was dirty, but she could see through it well enough. Lavinia stood on the platform watching. She did not wave. She simply stood there, straight-backed and still, until the train began to move and the distance swallowed her. Cordelia turned away from the window and looked at her hands. They were shaking slightly. She folded them in her lap and willed them to be still. 3 days to Montana. 3 days to think. 3 days before she saw what kind of exile Lavinia had prepared for her. The landscape changed as they traveled west. The orderly farmland of Pennsylvania gave way to the industrial sprawl of Ohio, and then the flat emptiness of the plains. Cordelia watched it all from her window. Mile after mile of nothing. Sky so big it seemed to press down on the earth. Towns that were barely towns, just a few buildings huddled together against the wind. The other passengers changed with each stop. Businessmen traveling to meetings in Chicago. Families heading west to claim homestead land. A group of miners returning to the silver fields. They looked at Cordelia curiously. A woman traveling alone was unusual. A woman traveling alone dressed in mourning was more unusual still. She kept to herself, ate the meals provided in the dining car, slept fitfully in her seat, and waited. Helena, Montana territory was smaller than Cordelia had imagined, and rougher. The buildings were wood, not stone. The streets were mud, not cobblestone. The air smelled of pine and smoke and horses. A man was waiting at the station with a wagon. He was perhaps 60 years old, weather-beaten and lean. He touched his hat when he saw her. "Mrs. Ashford, I am William Grant. Welcome to Montana." "Thank you, Mr. Grant." He loaded her trunks into the wagon with the ease of someone accustomed to physical labor. "It is another day's ride to the estate. We will stop overnight at a way station. I apologize for the accommodation. It is not what you are used to." "I will manage, Mr. Grant." They drove in silence. The road was barely a road, just 2 ruts worn into the ground by wagon wheels. The land on either side was vast and empty. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks already white with snow. Cordelia had never seen anything so big. New York was cramped and vertical. This was open and horizontal. It made her feel small in a way that was not entirely unpleasant. The way station was a low building made of logs. Inside it was dark and smelled of wood smoke and coffee. The proprietor, a woman with gray hair and capable hands, showed Cordelia to a small room with a narrow bed. "Supper is at 6, the woman said. "Breakfast at dawn. The outhouse is around back." Cordelia thanked her, sat on the bed. The mattress was thin and lumpy. The room was cold. Through the single small window she could see the mountains turning purple in the fading light. She placed her hand on her stomach, still flat, but perhaps not quite as flat as it had been. Or perhaps that was wishful thinking. "If you are in there," she whispered to the possibility of a child, "hold on. Just hold on a little longer." The Ashford estate came into view late the following afternoon. It sat in a valley between 2 ridges of mountains surrounded by fields that had once been cultivated, but were now returning to wild grass. The main house was large, built of timber and stone with a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides. It should have been impressive. Instead, it looked abandoned. How long has the estate been unoccupied? Cordelia asked. Grant shifted in his seat. 5 years, ma'am. Maybe 6. Mr. Ashford Sr. used to come out every summer when the railroad first came through. But after he passed, and then when Mr. Augustus took ill, he trailed off. Mrs. Whitmore gave orders to maintain the basics, but not much beyond that. The basics. Cordelia could see what that meant as they drew closer. The porch sagged. Several windows were broken. The fields were overgrown. Outbuildings that had once been barns or stables were missing shingles, their doors hanging crooked. How many staff are here? Just me and my wife, ma'am. We live in the foreman's cottage. There are 4 ranch hands who come in when needed, but we have not been running cattle or crops for some time now. 2 people to maintain 50,000 acres. Lavinia had not sent Cordelia to recuperate. She had sent her to rot. The inside of the house was worse than the outside. Dust covered every surface. The furniture was draped in sheets. The air was stale and cold. Grant led her through rooms that echoed with their footsteps. We have prepared the main bedroom for you, ma'am. Got a fire going this morning to take the chill off. My wife left some supper in the kitchen. He showed her to a room on the 2nd floor. It was large, with a 4-poster bed and a fireplace. Someone had indeed lit a fire. It crackled in the grate, providing the only warmth in a house that felt like it had been cold for years. Will you need anything else tonight, ma'am? No, Mr. Grant. Thank you. He left. Cordelia heard his footsteps descend the stairs, heard the front door close, then silence. Complete and total silence. She walked to the window. Outside, the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. The valley was filling with shadow. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. Cordelia unpacked her nightgown, changed for bed. The sheets were clean but rough. The pillow was flat. She lay down and stared at the ceiling. This was where they expected her to give up, to write letters home begging to return, to prove that she was as weak and incapable as they had always believed. She would not give them the satisfaction. She placed her hand on her stomach one more time. We will survive this, she whispered. Both of us. Then she closed her eyes and slept. The bleeding started 3 weeks later. Cordelia woke in the middle of the night to cramping pain low in her abdomen. For a moment she thought it was indigestion from the venison stew Mrs. Grant had made for supper. Then she felt the wetness between her legs and knew. She lit the lamp beside the bed. The sheets were stained red. Not much. Not yet. But enough. She stood slowly. The cramping intensified. She gripped the bedpost and waited for it to pass. It did not pass. It got worse. She made it to the basin on the dresser before the next wave hit. The pain was sharp and twisting. She doubled over, her hands braced on the edge of the dresser, breathing through her teeth. It went on for hours. The cramping, the bleeding, the small clots of tissue that meant the pregnancy was ending before it had barely begun. Cordelia did not cry out, did not call for help. Mrs. Grant was in the cottage 100 yards away and would have come if summoned. But Cordelia could not bear the thought of witnesses to this particular failure. By dawn, it was over. The cramping had subsided to a dull ache. The bleeding had slowed. Cordelia cleaned herself, changed the sheets, bundled the soiled linens into the bottom of her trunk. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her hands. They were trembling again. She made them stop. There had been a child. For a few weeks there had been a possibility, and now there was not. The last piece of leverage she might have had against Lavinia was gone. She was alone in Montana with no allies, no resources, no way forward, and no way back. Cordelia stood, walked to the window. The sun was rising over the mountains, turning the snow on the peaks pink and gold. The valley was filling with light. She had two choices. She could write to Lavinia, admit defeat, beg to be allowed to return. Lavinia would let her come back. Probably. She would be gracious about it. Poor Cordelia, not suited for the rigors of frontier life. We did our best. Or she could stay. She could take this broken estate and this exile and this expectation of failure, and she could turn it into something else. They had sent her here to disappear. What if instead she became visible in a way they never expected? Cordelia turned from the window. The room was cold, but she was not shivering anymore. She felt something settling in her chest. Not hope exactly, not yet, but something harder. Something that felt like determination wrapped in rage. If she was gonna be exiled, she would make this exile count. She dressed quickly, went downstairs, found Grant in the barn checking on the few horses they kept. "Mr. Grant, I need to see the account books for the estate." Grant looked surprised. "The books, ma'am?" "Yes, all financial records for the past 5 years. Everything. Mrs. Whitmore handles the finances from New York. I just manage the day-to-day operations here." "I understand. But there must be local records, expenses, purchases, debts." Grant hesitated. "There are some records in the estate office, but they are not in good order. No one has looked at them in years. I will look at them now." The estate office was a small room off the main hall. The desk was buried under papers. Ledgers were stacked haphazardly on shelves. Everything was covered in the same thick dust that coated the rest of the house. Cordelia opened the first ledger. The handwriting was barely legible. The numbers made no sense. Entries crossed out. Calculations wrong. Debts listed without any indication whether they had been paid. She opened another ledger. And another. The picture that emerged was not just neglect. It was sabotage. The estate owed money to every merchant in Helena. Feed stores, hardware stores, the bank. The debts had been accruing interest for years. Some of the creditors had filed liens against the property. But the estate also had income, or should have had. There were entries for cattle sold, timber harvested, land leased to neighboring ranchers, money that should have been coming in, except it was not coming in. Or if it was not being recorded here. Cordelia sat back in the chair, looked at the mess of papers spread before her. Lavinia had not just exiled her. Lavinia had deliberately run the estate into the ground. Racked up debts, pocketed the income, created a financial disaster that would justify selling the property for pennies on the dollar. Probably to a buyer Lavinia already had lined up. Someone who would pay her under the table while the official sale price barely covered the liens. It was elegant, really. Ruthless but elegant. Cordelia pushed back from the desk, walked to the window. Outside, Grant was leading a horse to the water trough. The animal was thin. Too thin. Everything here was starved. The land, the animals, the house itself. Starved but not dead. Not yet. She returned to the desk, began sorting papers into piles. Debts, income, contracts, correspondence. It took hours. Her fingers grew black with dust. Her eyes strained in the weak winter light. But slowly, a pattern emerged. The estate was in terrible shape, yes, but it was not beyond saving. The land was good. The water rights were intact. The timber stands were mature and valuable. The location, once the railroad pushed another 20 miles west, would be prime grazing land. Someone with money and knowledge and time could turn this around. Cordelia had none of those things, but she had something else. She had nothing left to lose. She worked through the afternoon, through supper, which she forgot to eat, into the evening. Mrs. Grant knocked once to ask if she needed anything. Cordelia sent her away. At midnight, she finally stopped, stood, stretched. Her back ached. Her head throbbed. But she had a list. 12 creditors who needed to be contacted. 6 contracts that needed to be renegotiated. 4 potential income streams that could be activated immediately if she could find the labor and the capital. And one more thing. She pulled open the bottom drawer of the desk. Inside, buried under old correspondence, she found what she was looking for. A surveyor's report from 1869. The year before Augustus had gotten sick. The year before everything had started to fall apart. She read it by lamplight. Read it twice to be sure. The survey had been commissioned to assess water resources on the property. The surveyor had found something. Underground. A massive aquifer running beneath the eastern fields. Deep enough to require drilling, but once accessed enough water to irrigate thousands of acres. There was a note in the margin in handwriting she recognized as Augustus's. Promising. Investigate further. But no further investigation had happened. Augustus had fallen ill. Lavinia had taken over. And this report had been filed away and forgotten. Cordelia stood holding the surveyor's report in both hands. Water. The one thing this land needed most. The one thing that could transform it from marginal grazing land into something genuinely valuable. It was here, right beneath their feet, waiting. She looked around the office, at the piles of papers documenting years of failure and neglect, at the ledgers full of debt. Somewhere in New York, Lavinia Whitmore was probably sleeping peacefully in her silk sheets, certain that Cordelia would either give up and come crawling back or fade away into obscurity. Lavinia was wrong. Cordelia went to the desk, found clean paper and a pen, began to write. Not to Lavinia, not to anyone in New York. She wrote to the surveyor whose name was on the report. She wrote to 3 engineering firms in San Francisco. She wrote to the bank in Helena requesting a meeting to discuss the liens against the property. She wrote until dawn. When she finally put down the pen, her hand was cramped and ink-stained. But she had a plan. Mrs. Grant found her asleep at the desk at 8 in the morning. She woke Cordelia gently. "Ma'am, you have been in here all night." Cordelia sat up. Every muscle in her body protested. "I need these letters posted today. Can Mr. Grant take them to Helena?" Mrs. Grant looked at the stack of envelopes. "That is quite a lot of correspondence, ma'am." "Yes, it is. It is the beginning." "The beginning of what, if you do not mind my asking?" Cordelia stood, looked around the office, at the papers she had sorted, at the ledgers she had deciphered, at the surveyor's report lying on the desk. "The beginning of proving that everyone who wrote me off made a very serious mistake." Mrs. Grant said nothing for a moment. Then she smiled. It was small, but it was real. "I will have Mr. Grant leave within the hour." Over the following weeks, Cordelia learned what it meant to build something from nothing. She learned that knowledge was not the same as capability, that wanting something was not the same as knowing how to achieve it. She learned about soil types from the ranch hands, learned about irrigation from books ordered from San Francisco, learned about cattle breeding from the neighboring rancher who came by to offer condolences on her widowhood, and stayed to give advice when he saw she was actually listening. She learned to keep accounts properly, to negotiate with creditors who assumed a woman could be bullied into accepting bad terms, to walk the property lines until she knew every fence post, every water source, every rocky outcrop. She learned that her hands could blister and then callous, that her back could ache from labor and still be made to work the next day, that she could function on 4 hours of sleep and coffee, strong enough to strip paint. The responses to her letters began arriving in January. The surveyor was dead, but his son had taken over the business and remembered the report. Yes, the aquifer was still there. Yes, it could be tapped. But it would require capital, significant capital. The engineering firms sent estimates, astronomical numbers that made Cordelia's stomach drop. The bank in Helena agreed to meet, but made it clear they saw no reason to extend credit to a woman managing a failing estate. Every door she approached was either closed or barely cracked. But Cordelia kept pushing. In February, one of the engineering firms sent a different kind of letter. They had a junior engineer willing to come out and assess the site for half the usual fee. He was young and trying to build a reputation. He would work cheap if the project succeeded and could be used as a reference. It was not much, but it was not nothing. Cordelia wrote back immediately. Yes, come in the spring. March brought mud that swallowed wagon wheels and made every trip to town an ordeal. It brought wind that seemed to blow, constantly rattling windows and stripping paint. It brought Cordelia's 32nd birthday, which she celebrated alone with a piece of dried apple pie Mrs. Grant had made. It also brought a letter from Lavinia. Cordelia held the envelope for a long time before opening it. The paper was thick and expensive. The handwriting was Lavinia's perfect copperplate script. "My dear Cordelia, I trust this letter finds you well, and that the mountain air is proving restorative as Augustus hoped. I have received your correspondence regarding the estate finances. While I applaud your interest in understanding the family affairs, I must caution you against overexertion. These matters are complex and are best left to those with experience in such things. I am pleased to inform you that I have received an offer for the Montana property. A very fair offer considering the state of disrepair. I believe it would be wise to accept and use the proceeds to establish you in a small but comfortable household, perhaps in Boston or Philadelphia, where you might build a new life. Please write to me with your thoughts on this matter at your earliest convenience. Yours in continued affection, Lavinia." Cordelia read the letter twice. Then she walked to the fireplace and fed it to the flames. Lavinia wanted her to sell. Of course she did. Because if Cordelia sold, Lavinia could take her percentage as estate manager and wash her hands of the whole situation. Cordelia would be removed from the Ashford holdings permanently, too poor to fight back and too isolated to cause trouble. The fire consumed the letter, turning Lavinia's perfect script to ash. Cordelia turned away from the fireplace, looked around the office that had become her command center, at the maps she had pinned to the walls, showing property boundaries and water sources, at the ledgers she had reorganized, at the plan she had been building piece by careful piece. She sat down at the desk, took up her pen. "Dear Aunt Lavinia, thank you for your concern regarding my welfare. I am indeed well. The mountain air suits me. Regarding the offer for the estate, I must respectfully decline. I have no interest in selling at this time. I have plans for this property that I believe Augustus would have supported. I will handle the estate matters myself going forward. Please consider this letter formal notice that I am assuming direct management of all Ashford holdings in Montana territory. Yours, Cordelia Ashford." She sealed the letter, posted it the next day. Then she went back to work. 3 years changes a person. 3 years in a place that wants you gone teaches you things that polite society never could. Cordelia learned them all. She learned that soil could be read like a book if you knew the language, that water moved underground in patterns older than nations, that a fence line meant nothing if the posts were not set deep enough to survive the winter frost. She learned to wake at dawn because daylight was currency, and you spent every minute of it. Learned to sleep through wind that rattled the house like bones in a box. Learned the particular exhaustion that comes from building something with your own hands, the kind of tired that lives in your muscles and makes you dream in images of wood grain and stone. By the spring of 1876, the Ashford estate had changed. Not dramatically, not in ways that would impress anyone from New York, but in ways that mattered. The irrigation system was still more dream than reality. But Cordelia had convinced the young engineer from San Francisco to stake his reputation on it. They had drilled 3 test wells. 2 had failed. The third had hit water at 60 feet, exactly where the old survey had predicted. The water had come up sweet and cold enough flow to convince the engineer that the aquifer was real. The system itself was elegant in its simplicity. A series of channels cut into the earth lined with stone gravity, fed from a reservoir they would build at the high point of the eastern fields. It would take 2 years to complete. It would cost every penny Cordelia could borrow, beg or extract from creditors who still thought she was insane. But it would work. The cattle operation had restarted on a small scale. 40 head of good breeding stock purchased from a rancher in Wyoming who had needed cash more than he needed cows. Cordelia had driven a hard bargain. She was getting good at that. Good at knowing when to push and when to hold back. Good at reading the moment when a man's pride made him stubborn, and the moment when his practical sense made him flexible. The timber operation was bringing in steady money. Not much, but steady. They were selectively harvesting the mature stands, selling to the lumber mills in Helena. Grant supervised the cutting. Cordelia handled the contracts. She had discovered she had a talent for contracts, for seeing where the leverage was hidden in the language. The debts were being paid down. Slowly. Too slowly. But consistently. Every month Cordelia sent money to another creditor. Every month she crossed another name off the list. The liens were still there hanging over everything like storm clouds, but they were not getting bigger. The ranch hands who had been ready to leave 3 years ago were still there. They had watched Cordelia transform from a New York widow in mourning dress to something else, something harder. They did not entirely know what to make of her. A woman who could calculate yield per acre, but also help pull a calf during a difficult birth. A woman who kept books like a banker but was not above digging post holes when they were short-handed. They respected her, though. Cordelia could feel it. It was different from the cold courtesy she had received in New York. This was earned respect. The kind that came from watching someone prove themselves day after day. Mrs. Grant had become something close to a friend, though neither woman would have used that word. They took coffee together most mornings before the work started, discussed what needed doing, sometimes talked about other things. Mrs. Grant's daughter in San Francisco, the weather, the territorial politics that might affect land grants. Mrs. Grant never asked about New York, never asked why a woman like Cordelia had ended up here. She seemed to understand that some stories did not need telling. Cordelia was 34 years old. Her hair had more gray than it had 3 years ago. Her hands were no longer soft. The birthmark on her face had been weathered by sun and wind until it was just another part of her, unremarkable against skin that had tanned and freckled and stopped caring what anyone thought about it. She stood now on the eastern ridge, looking down at the land that was becoming hers in a way that had nothing to do with legal ownership. The valley spread below green with spring growth. The test well stood like a declaration. The channels for the irrigation system were rough cuts in the earth, waiting to be lined with stone. It was not beautiful yet, but it would be. A rider was coming up the main road from Helena. Cordelia watched the dust trail, trying to place who it might be. Too early for the mail. Grant was in town, but he had taken the wagon, not a horse. The neighboring ranchers all came from different directions. She walked down from the ridge, reached the main house as the rider was dismounting. He was tall, broad across the shoulders, moving with the careful precision of someone who had learned to favor one side. When he turned, she saw the reason. His left leg did not bend quite right. Old injury, long healed but permanent. He was perhaps 40, dressed in clothes that were too fine for ranch work, but not fancy enough to mark him as wealthy. His hair was dark with silver at the temples. His eyes were a shade between gray and green that changed as the light hit them. He removed his hat when he saw her. Mrs. Ashford, yes. Sterling Marlowe, Federal Land Office. I apologize for arriving unannounced. I sent a letter 2 weeks ago, but I suspect it has not reached you yet. Cordelia felt something cold settle in her chest. The Federal Land Office did not send inspectors for social calls. They came when there were questions about claims about water rights, about whether the land was being used according to the terms of the original grant. What can I do for you, Mr. Marlowe? I'm conducting a routine survey of federal land grants in the territory. The Ashford estate holds significant acreage under terms that require productive use. I am here to verify compliance. Routine. The word itself was a warning. Nothing the federal government did was routine unless it was looking for a reason to revoke something. I see. Would you like to begin now, or would you prefer to rest from your journey first? Something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, maybe. He had been expecting resistance, or nervousness, or the kind of fluttering helplessness that some men expected from women. Now would be fine if it is convenient. It is convenient. Let me show you the property. They walked for 3 hours. Cordelia showed him everything. The test well, the irrigation channels in progress, the cattle in the north pasture, the timber stands being selectively harvested, the books in the estate office with their careful records of income and expenditure. Marlowe did not say much. He made notes in a small leather journal, asked questions that were pointed without being aggressive. How many head of cattle? What was the annual timber yield? Who held the water rights? What were the terms of the loans used to finance improvements? Cordelia answered everything. She had learned that the best defense was complete transparency. Men like Marlowe were looking for things that did not add up. Give them numbers that did add up, and they had nothing to hold against you. They ended back at the main house as the sun was lowering. Mrs. Grant had left coffee on the stove. Cordelia poured 2 cups, brought them to the office where Marlowe was reviewing his notes. You have made substantial improvements, he said, accepting the coffee. The irrigation system alone represents significant investment. It does. Risky investment. If the aquifer proves less robust than the survey suggests, you will have spent capital with no return. That is true of any investment, Mr. Marlowe. Nothing worthwhile comes without risk. He looked at her over the rim of his cup. The federal government prefers land grants to be in hands capable of responsible stewardship. And am I not demonstrating responsible stewardship? You are demonstrating ambition. The two are not always the same. Cordelia set down her cup. Mr. Marlowe, if you have concerns about my management of this property, I would appreciate hearing them directly, rather than in the form of implications. For the first time, he smiled. It changed his face completely, made him look younger, less severe. You are not what I expected, Mrs. Ashford. What did you expect? A New York widow playing at ranching until she tired of it and sold to the first buyer willing to take the property off her hands. And instead I find someone who knows the difference between limestone and sandstone when it comes to lining irrigation channels. Someone who has read enough about soil composition to argue with my assessment of the eastern fields. Someone who is either extremely well educated or has been working very hard to become so. Cordelia said nothing, waited. Marlowe closed his journal. I will file a report stating that the Ashford estate is in compliance with federal land use requirements. More than compliance, actually. You are setting a standard that other properties in the territory would do well to follow. Relief flooded through her. She kept it off her face. Thank you. Do not thank me yet. I am not finished. The cold returned. Oh, I would like to stay for the rest of the week if you can accommodate me. There are some questions I have, not about the land use, about the financial arrangements surrounding this property. What kind of questions? Marlowe stood, walked to the window, looked out at the valley in the fading light. Mrs. Ashford, how much do you know about Lavinia Whitmore's business practices? Cordelia's pulse quickened. I know she manages the Ashford estate, or managed it until I took over direct control 3 years ago. And before that, when your husband was alive, she managed his affairs when he became too ill to do so himself. Did you ever wonder why a woman with no family connection to the Ashfords would be so intimately involved in their finances? She was Augustus's godmother. It seemed natural. Marlowe turned back to face her. His expression was different now, harder. My father was Harrison Marlowe. Do you recognize the name? No. He was an investor. Not a major one, but successful enough. In 1865, he purchased shares in the Northern Pacific Railroad based on a prospectus provided by an investment broker. The broker was very convincing. The prospectus was very detailed. The shares were worthless. By the time my father discovered this, he had invested everything he had. Cordelia went very still. What was the broker's name? Jonathan Whitmore, Lavinia's husband. Except there was no Jonathan Whitmore. There was only Lavinia using her husband's name because women were not permitted to broker securities. She had created the false prospectus. She had sold the worthless shares. She had taken my father's money and the money of 6 other men and disappeared it into accounts that could not be traced. The room felt smaller, colder. Your father killed himself 6 months later. jumped from a bridge in Chicago, left a note that said he could not live with the shame of what he had lost. I was 16. Mr. Marlowe, I am sorry. Truly, but I do not see what this has to do with. I have been investigating Lavinia Whitmore for 3 years. Mrs. Ashford, since I got this position with the land office, I have been using it to examine every property she has touched, every estate she has managed, every fortune she has overseen. And in every single case I have found the same pattern: money flowing in, less money flowing out. The difference vanishing into arrangements so complex that proving fraud would require resources I do not have. Cordelia's mind was racing. You think she has been stealing from the Ashford estate? I think she has been systematically embezzling from every family foolish enough to trust her with their finances. Your husband's estate is one of 7 I have documented. But documentation is not proof. I need records that show where the money went. I need someone on the inside who has access to the real books, not the ones Lavinia shows to lawyers and judges. I do not have those records. Everything she did from New York. But she had to have local accounts, banks where the estate income was deposited before being transferred east, ledgers showing what came in versus what was reported. You have been managing this property for 3 years. You must have seen discrepancies. Cordelia thought about the chaos she had found when she first opened the estate office. The missing entries, the contracts that did not match the income reported, the debts that seemed designed to drain the property dry. I have seen discrepancies, she said slowly. I assume they were the result of neglect, of poor management. Perhaps some were. But I would wager that if you look closely, you will find that money was being systematically siphoned away. Not enough to be obvious, just enough year after year to bleed the estate while maintaining the appearance of legitimate management. Why are you telling me this? Marlowe met her eyes. Because I need help. Because the federal government does not care about civil fraud against private citizens. Because I have been doing this alone for 3 years, and I am no closer to building a case that would hold up in court. And because you, Mrs. Ashford, are the first person I have met who has both the access and the reason to want Lavinia Whitmore brought to justice. Cordelia walked to the window, stood beside him. Outside, the light was almost gone. The valley was filling with blue shadow. If what you say is true, she said quietly, if Lavinia has been stealing from this estate for years, then proving it will destroy her. It will also destroy any claim she has to managing the Ashford holdings, which means I would gain full control. Yes, which gives me a motive that could be questioned. Makes me look like I am using fraud accusations to settle a personal grievance. Also, yes. So why would I help you? Why would I risk my own credibility to pursue something that might fail and would certainly make me enemies? Marlowe was quiet for a moment. Because it is the right thing to do. Because 7 families have been victimized, and you have the power to give them justice. Because a woman who spent 3 years turning a failing ranch into a profitable operation is not someone who backs down from difficult fights. Cordelia turned to look at him. You do not know me, Mr. Marlowe. You have been here less than a day. I know you well enough. I know that when you showed me the irrigation system, you did not talk about how pretty it would be or how it would increase property values. You talked about how it would transform marginal land into productive acres, how it would provide jobs, how it would prove that this region could support sustainable agriculture. That is not how someone talks when they are playing at ranching. That is how someone talks when they are building something that matters. Pretty words, Mr. Marlowe. True words, Mrs. Ashford. They stood in silence. Outside, the first stars were appearing. Cordelia thought about Lavinia in her ice-blue silk and her perfect pearls. Thought about the funeral where Lavinia had smiled when Augustus's coffin went into the ground. Thought about the will that had been signed when Augustus was too drugged and too weak to understand what he was signing. I will help you, Cordelia said, but on one condition, which is, when this is over, when we have proof and can take it to court, I want more than just control of the estate. I want everything Lavinia has taken. Every penny. Not for me. I want it returned to the families she stole from, including yours. Marlowe said nothing for a long moment. Then he extended his hand. Agreed. Cordelia shook it. His grip was firm, honest. The handshake of someone who meant what they said. Then we should begin, she said. The local bank in Helena might have records, and there is a lawyer in town who handled some early transactions. He might still have copies of documents. We will need to be careful. If Lavinia suspects we are investigating her, she already suspects I am a problem. That is why I am here instead of New York. Being a bigger problem will not change her opinion of me. Marlowe smiled again. No, I suppose it will not. They worked through the night. Cordelia showed him everything she had found in the estate office. Marlowe made notes, asked questions, pointed out patterns she had not seen before. When Mrs. Grant came in at dawn to start the breakfast, she found them both still at the desk, surrounded by ledgers and correspondents drinking coffee that had gone cold hours ago. Marlowe stayed for a week, then 2, then a month. He made trips to Helena, to the bank, to the land office, came back with more documents, more evidence, more pieces of a puzzle that was slowly taking shape. They fell into a routine. Mornings were for the ranch work. Cordelia could not abandon the property just because she was building a legal case. The cattle still needed tending. The irrigation project still needed supervision. The books still needed keeping. Afternoons and evenings were for the investigation. They went through 10 years of records, cross-referenced bank deposits with reported income, tracked transfers that went to New York and never came back, found contractors who had been paid twice for the same work, once by the estate and once by Lavinia personally, with the estate payment going into Lavinia's accounts. It was meticulous work, exhausting work, the kind of work that required attention to detail and the patience to follow threads that went nowhere for weeks before suddenly connecting to something important. Cordelia discovered she was good at it. good at seeing the shapes in the numbers, good at remembering which document corresponded to which transaction 6 months later, good at asking the questions that Marlowe had not thought to ask. They argued sometimes about interpretation of evidence, about legal strategy, about whether a particular piece of documentation was strong enough to use or would undermine their case by being too ambiguous. The arguments were productive. Neither of them was interested in being right for the sake of ego. They were interested in building something that would stand up under scrutiny. Mrs. Grant watched this unfold with the quiet observation of someone who had seen much in her 60 years and was not easily surprised. She said nothing, but Cordelia caught her smiling occasionally. Small, private smiles that suggested approval. It was late July when everything changed. Cordelia was in Helena, meeting with the surveyor's son about the next phase of the irrigation project. Marlowe was at the estate going through correspondence that had just arrived from the Territorial Land Office. She returned to find him standing in the office with a telegram in his hand, and an expression that made her stop in the doorway. What happened? Lavinia knows. She knows we are investigating her. How? I do not know. Someone in Helena, maybe. Someone who reported back to her that a federal land inspector has been spending an unusual amount of time at the Ashford estate. Someone who put together that you and I have been asking questions about financial records. Cordelia took the telegram from him. It was addressed to her, sent from New York that morning. Urgent stop. Financial irregularities discovered. Ashford. Estate stop. Immediate audit required. Stop. Federal inspection suspended pending review. Stop. Return NYC. Immediately stop. Whitmore. She is pulling the money, Marlowe said. Right now. As we stand here. She is closing accounts, transferring funds, destroying evidence. By the time we could get a court order to freeze the assets, there will be nothing left to freeze. Cordelia felt the ground shift beneath her feet. How much money are we talking about? From this estate alone. Based on what we have documented so far, probably $120,000 over 10 years. $120,000. More than enough to complete the irrigation system. More than enough to pay off every debt purchase. More cattle expand the timber operation. Enough to make the estate not just viable, but genuinely prosperous. Gone. Or about to be. Can we stop her? Not legally. Not fast enough. By the time we file the paperwork, get a hearing, convince a judge that a respected New York society matron is an embezzler, she will have moved everything offshore or into trusts we cannot touch. Cordelia walked to the window, looked out at the valley, at the irrigation channels half built, at the future she had been constructing piece by careful piece for 3 years. There has to be something we can do. Marlowe was quiet. When she turned back, he was holding another document. This one older, yellowed at the edges. I found this in the bottom of a file box. It was stuck to the back of another document. I almost missed it. He handed it to her. It was a letter. Written in handwriting Cordelia recognized immediately as Augustus's. The letter was dated March 1873. 2 months before he died. My dearest Cordelia, if you are reading this, I am gone and things have proceeded as I feared they would. Lavinia has managed to do what she has planned for so long. She has taken control. I discovered 6 months ago what she has been doing. The investments that were not investments. The transfers that went only one direction. I confronted her. She did not deny it. She said I had been a fool to trust her, and that my death would be convenient for everyone. That night I became very ill. The doctors said it was my heart. But I know what poison tastes like, Cordelia. My father died of the same thing, the same symptoms, the same progression. Lavinia was there both times. I am writing this in a moment of clarity before the next dose of medicine she brings me. I will hide it where I hope you might find it someday. I do not know if you will. I do not know if it will matter. But if you are reading this, know that I am sorry. Sorry for bringing you into this family. Sorry for leaving you vulnerable to her. Sorry that I was not strong enough to stop her before she made you another one of her victims. The green bottle on my bedside table, the one she says is heart tonic. Have it tested. You will find arsenic. I wish I had been a better husband to you. I wish I had given you the life you deserved instead of this mess. Forgive me. Augustus. Cordelia read the letter 3 times. Her hands were shaking. She made them stop. This proves she murdered him. It proves he believed she murdered him. A defense lawyer would argue it was the delusion of a sick man. We would need the bottle. We would need to test it. The bottle is long gone. The estate was cleared after the funeral. Everything was disposed of or packed away. Then we have a letter written by a dying man making an accusation he cannot prove. It is powerful. It is damning. But it is not necessarily enough to convict. Cordelia set the letter down on the desk, looked at it. Augustus's handwriting still clear and strong, despite whatever poison was already in his system. He had known he was dying, had known Lavinia was killing him, and he had tried in the only way left to him to warn her. She is not going to stop, Cordelia said quietly. Even if we expose the embezzlement, even if we prove she stole from all those families, she will find a way to survive. People like Lavinia always do. They have lawyers and connections and enough money hidden away to start over somewhere else. Probably. So what do we do? Marlowe looked at the letter. We fight with what we have. We take this to the newspapers. We take it to every family she victimized. We make enough noise that she cannot hide from it. It might not put her in prison, but it will destroy her reputation. And for someone like Lavinia, that might be worse than prison. Or, Cordelia said slowly, we make her panic. Explain. Right now she is acting carefully, covering her tracks, moving money in ways that will be hard to trace. But what if she thought we had more evidence than we do? What if she thought we had proof that would put her away for murder? Not just embezzlement. You want to bluff. I want to make her desperate. Desperate people make mistakes. And I want her to know. that I know what she did. I want her to understand that the woman she tried to bury is standing over her grave instead. Marlowe studied her. That is risky. Everything worth doing is risky, Mr. Marlowe. You told me that yourself. He smiled. I was talking about irrigation systems. The principle is the same. They sent the letter the next day, not to Lavinia directly, to the New York Herald, along with copies of the financial documents they had assembled, along with a cover letter laying out the full scope of what they believed Lavinia had done: embezzlement, fraud, murder. The letter was careful to say alleged and suspected in all the right places. But the implications were clear. The response came faster than either of them expected. 2 weeks after the Herald letter was sent, before it could even be published, the timber mill burned. It happened at night. No one saw how it started. The fire moved fast, feeding on dry wood and turpentine. By the time Grant and the ranch hands got there with buckets, it was too late. The mill burned to the ground, took with it 6 months of cut timber waiting to be transported to Helena, $60,000 of inventory, gone in 6 hours. Cordelia stood in the ashes the next morning. The smell of smoke was thick in the air. The ground was still hot enough to burn through boot soles if you stood in one place too long. Grant stood beside her, soot-streaked and exhausted. Could have been an accident. Could have been a spark from the kiln. Could have been. Cordelia agreed, but they both knew it was not. That afternoon, a rider came from the bank in Helena. Cordelia met him on the porch. He would not meet her eyes. "Mrs. Ashford, I have instructions from New York. Mrs. Whitmore has withdrawn all funds from the estate operating account. She says the account will be closed pending resolution of legal questions about property management." "How much did she withdraw?" "Everything, ma'am. All 120,000. Cordelia felt the world tilt, held onto the porch railing until it steadied. "I see. Thank you for bringing me this information personally." The rider left. Cordelia remained on the porch. Marlowe came out, stood beside her. "She declared war," he said. "Yes. The estate is effectively bankrupt. No cash reserves, no way to pay creditors. The liens will start being called. The banks will foreclose. Yes. I am sorry, Cordelia. This is my fault. I pushed too hard, too fast. I should have waited until we had enough evidence to go directly to a prosecutor." Cordelia turned to look at him. "Do you know what I learned in 3 years of building this place, Mr. Marlowe? I learned that sometimes things have to get worse before they can get better. Sometimes you have to burn away everything that is dead so something new can grow. That is a nice metaphor, but metaphors do not pay debts. No, but determination does, and I am not finished yet. She went inside, up to Augustus's old bedroom, the one she had never occupied after moving to Montana. The furniture was still there under dust covers. She pulled the covers off the wardrobe, opened it. His clothes were still hanging inside. She had not been able to bring herself to dispose of them. They smelled faintly of the cologne he had worn. of pipe tobacco, of the past. She searched through the pockets of every jacket, every pair of trousers, found nothing but old receipts and a handkerchief. Then she pulled out the trunk at the bottom of the wardrobe, the one with his personal effects, the things that had been with him in his final days: books, a pipe, a watch, correspondence, and at the very bottom, wrapped in cloth, a small green glass bottle. Her hands shook as she unwrapped it. The bottle was half full of dark liquid. The label read, "Heart Tonic, to be taken twice daily." She held it up to the light. Marlowe appeared in the doorway, saw what she was holding. "Is that—" "Yes." "How—" "I could not throw it away. After he died, after everything was being packed up, I took it. I do not know why. Maybe some part of me already knew. We need to have it tested. Find out if there is actually arsenic. We will. But first, we need to let Lavinia know we have it." Cordelia went downstairs, sat at the desk, wrote a letter in her clearest hand. "Dear Aunt Lavinia, I found something interesting today. A bottle of heart tonic that Augustus was taking in his final months. I have sent it to a chemist in San Francisco for analysis. I expect the results will be illuminating." I also found his letter, the one where he explains exactly what you did to him, what you have been doing to everyone who trusted you. You tried to destroy me. You sent me here hoping I would fade away into nothing. Instead, I built something. And now I am going to use what I built to take everything from you. The Herald will publish our findings next week. By the time you read this, everyone in New York will know what you are. You wanted me gone. You should have made certain I was dead. Cordelia Ashford. She did not sign it with affection. She did not sign it with anything except her name. She sealed the letter, sent it express. It would reach New York in 5 days. Then she turned to Marlowe. "How long before the banks start foreclosure proceedings?" 60 days maybe. 90 if we are lucky. Then we have 60 days to finish this. To gather every piece of evidence, build a case so airtight that no lawyer can crack it and take it to court. Cordelia, we do not have the resources. We do not have the money to hire the kind of legal team this would require. Then we will do it ourselves. You have 3 years of investigation. I have 3 years of understanding how this estate works and how Lavinia manipulated it. Together we have everything we need except time and money." Cordelia smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. "I have been poor before, Mr. Marlowe. It is not permanent. But what Lavinia has done, what she is, that is permanent. And I am going to make sure everyone knows it." They worked without stopping. 16 hours a day. 18, 20. Sleep became something stolen in brief stretches between documents. Food became fuel consumed without tasting. They built their case piece by piece. Bank records showing deposits that did not match reported income. Contracts that had been altered after signing. Testimony from contractors who had been paid twice once officially, And once under the table with the official payment disappearing into Lavinia's accounts, they found the families, all 6 of them besides the Ashfords, families who had lost fortunes to Lavinia's schemes. Some had died in poverty. Others had rebuilt but never forgotten. All of them wanted justice. The chemist's report came back in late August. The green bottle contained enough arsenic to kill a man slowly over the course of months, mixed with actual heart medicine to disguise the taste and the symptoms until it was too late. Murder. Proven. They took everything to a prosecutor in San Francisco, a man who had built his career on taking down corruption, a man who believed that the law should protect everyone, not just the wealthy. He reviewed their evidence for 3 days. Then he called them into his office. "This is extraordinary work," he said. "The documentation alone would take my staff months to compile. You have done it in weeks." "Will you take the case?" Cordelia asked. "I will take the case, but I need you to understand something. Lavinia Whitmore has resources. She has lawyers. She has friends in positions of power. This will not be quick, and it will not be easy." "Nothing worth doing is," Cordelia said. The prosecutor smiled. "No, I suppose it is not." They filed charges in September. Embezzlement, fraud, murder. The newspapers picked it up immediately. The New York Herald ran it on the front page. A society matron accused of crimes spanning decades. The evidence laid out in meticulous detail. New York society reacted with shock, then disbelief, then slowly terrible understanding. Cordelia returned to Montana to wait. The estate was still bankrupt. The creditors were still circling. But now they were hesitating. Because if the charges stuck, if Lavinia was convicted, all that stolen money would have to be returned, and Cordelia would control where it went. October brought the first snow. Cordelia stood on the porch watching it fall, white and silent and clean, covering the burned remains of the mill, covering the half-finished irrigation channels, covering everything. Marlowe came out, stood beside her. He had been preparing to return to San Francisco for the trial. His bags were packed. "The prosecutor thinks we have a strong case," he said, "but he wants you there, to testify, to show the jury what Lavinia did to you. I will be there. It will mean facing her, in court, in public. Good. I want her to see me. I want her to understand that the woman she tried to erase is the one who brought her down." Marlowe was quiet for a moment. "You have changed since I first met you." "Yes. You were angry then, determined but angry. Now you are something else." "What am I now? Dangerous?" Cordelia smiled, watched the snow fall. "Good." The reckoning. The winter of 1879 was the longest Cordelia had ever known. Not because of the weather, though Montana delivered cold that could crack timber and freeze breath in the lungs. Long because waitin' is always longer than doin'. long because building a case is one thing and watching it be dismantled by lawyers who make their living defending the indefensible is another. The prosecutor, a man named Robert Hutchins, who wore rumpled suits and had eyes like a hawk, watching prey, sent letters every week. Updates on depositions, on motions filed and motions denied, on the slow, grinding machinery of justice that seemed designed to exhaust anyone seeking it. Lavinia had hired the best defense team money could buy. 3 lawyers from the most prestigious firm in New York, men who had defended railroad barons and mining magnates, men who knew how to make juries doubt what they could see with their own eyes. They filed motions to dismiss, motions to suppress evidence, motions to delay. Each one required a response. Each response required time and money that Cordelia did not have. The estate was operating on borrowed time and borrowed funds. The creditors had agreed to hold off on foreclosure until the trial concluded. But their patience was finite. Every week brought new letters. Polite at first, then less polite, then barely concealing threats. Cordelia managed it all from the office that had become her war room. Correspondence spread across every surface. Legal documents stacked in precise piles. A map of New York City on the wall with pins marking the locations of witnesses they needed to depose. Marlowe was in San Francisco working with Hutchins. They had brought in 2 other families Lavinia had defrauded. The Claremonts, who had lost their shipping business. The Hendersons, whose banking fortune had evaporated. Both families had documentation. Both families wanted blood. The case was growing beyond just the Ashford estate. It was becoming something larger. A reckoning for every widow Lavinia had convinced to sign over control. Every businessman she had promised returns that never materialized. Every person who had been too trusting or too desperate to see the knife before it slid between their ribs. Cordelia received a letter in February from Hutchins that made her read twice to believe. Mrs. Ashford, we have obtained testimony from Dr. Morrison, the physician who certified your late husband's will. Under oath, he has admitted that Mrs. Whitmore provided him with specific instructions on what to write in his medical assessment. He further admits that he did not personally examine Mr. Ashford on the day the will was signed, but certified the document based on Mrs. Whitmore's assurance that it was a formality. This testimony, combined with the arsenic analysis and your husband's letter, gives us grounds to pursue murder charges in addition to the fraud and embezzlement. The trial date is set for December 1880. You will need to be in New York by November at the latest to prepare your testimony. I remain confident in our case, though I caution you that nothing is certain once a jury is involved. Respectfully, Robert Hutchins. Murder charges. Cordelia set the letter down, looked out the window at snow falling in sheets so thick the barn was barely visible. Augustus had known, had written it down, had tried to warn her. And now, 7 years after his death, he would get justice, she hoped. The months between February and November passed in a blur of preparation. Cordelia practiced her testimony with Marlowe during his visits to Montana. They went over every question Hutchins might ask, every attack the defense might make. They will try to discredit you, Marlowe said during one of these sessions. They will say you are a bitter widow with a grievance, that you are fabricating evidence to claim an inheritance you are not entitled to. Let them say it. The evidence speaks for itself. Evidence can be explained away. Your credibility cannot. If the jury does not believe you, if they see you as someone seeking revenge rather than justice, we lose. Then I will make them believe me. How? Cordelia thought about this, about the woman she had been 7 years ago. Quiet, deferential, trying to make herself smaller so the birthmark would seem less obvious, trying to be what New York wanted her to be. That woman was gone, buried somewhere in the Montana winter alongside all the other things she had left behind. I will tell them the truth, she said, finally. Not the polite version, not the version that makes me seem sympathetic. The truth. That Lavinia Whitmore is a predator who has spent decades perfecting the art of looking respectable while destroying lives, and that I am done being polite about it. Marlowe smiled. That might work. In October, Cordelia closed up the main house, left Grant and Mrs. Grant in charge of the ranch operations. The irrigation system was nearly complete. The water was flowing. The eastern fields were ready for spring planting. Everything she had built over 7 years was functional and profitable. Everything except the one thing that mattered most: justice. She took the train east with 2 trunks and a leather case containing copies of every document they would need for trial. The journey reversed the one she had made 7 years earlier. West to east instead of east to west. Returning instead of fleeing. But she was not the same woman who had left. New York in November was exactly as she remembered and completely foreign. The buildings were the same. The streets were the same. The carriages and the crowds and the smell of coal smoke mixed with horse manure all the same. But Cordelia moved through it differently now. She did not lower her eyes when people stared at her birthmark, did not apologize for taking up space, did not fade into corners at social gatherings she was obligated to attend. Not that there were many social gatherings. Word of the trial had made her persona non grata in the circles she had once inhabited. The women who had barely tolerated her before now actively avoided her. The men who had been politely dismissive were now openly hostile. Cordelia did not care. She took rooms at a modest hotel near the courthouse, spent her days with Hutchins and Marlowe preparing, spent her evenings reviewing documents until her eyes burned. Marlowe had taken rooms in the same hotel 2 floors up. He came down most evenings after the legal work was done, brought coffee or sometimes something stronger. They sat in the small parlor and talked about anything except the trial, Montana weather, books they had read, the irrigation system and whether the spring melt would provide enough water flow. Trivial things that felt enormous because they were normal. "Are you nervous?" Marlowe asked one evening 3 days before the trial was set to begin. "Terrified," Cordelia admitted. Not of the trial itself, but of failing. Of going through all of this and having a jury decide that a respectable society matron could not possibly be guilty of what we are accusing her of. That is a reasonable fear. Thank you for not telling me it is unfounded. I do not lie to you, Cordelia. It has been one of the better aspects of our partnership. Partnership. That was what they called it. What they had been calling it for 4 years now. Cordelia wondered if Marlowe felt the same pull she did, the same awareness of how close they sat when reviewing documents, the same careful distance they maintained to keep things professional. She had been widowed for 7 years. Marlowe had been widowed for 12. His wife had died in childbirth, the baby with her. He had mentioned it once briefly, and then never again. Both of them carrying losses, both of them rebuilding from wreckage. When this is over, Cordelia said, when we win or lose and the dust settles, what will you do? Marlowe looked at his coffee cup. I have been investigating Lavinia Whitmore for 5 years. I am not sure I know how to do anything else anymore. You could come to Montana. The estate will need a manager if I gain full control. Someone who understands both the land and the legal complexities. Are you offering me a job, Mrs. Ashford? I am offering you a future that is not defined by the past. Same thing you helped give me. He met her eyes. I will think about it. The trial began on December 1st, 1880. The courtroom was packed. Journalists filled the gallery. Society figures who claimed friendship with Lavinia sat in the front rows dressed in black as if attending a funeral, which in a sense they were. Cordelia sat at the prosecutor's table beside Hutchins. Marlowe was in the gallery, having been barred from the prosecution table since he would be called as a witness. Lavinia entered with her legal team. She was 71 years old now and looked every year of it. The perfect posture was still there, the expensive clothes. But something had cracked. You could see it in the tightness around her eyes, the way her hands gripped her lawyer's arm. She looked at Cordelia once, just once. The look said everything. Rage and disbelief and something that might have been fear. Cordelia looked back, did not smile, did not flinch, simply held the gaze until Lavinia turned away. The judge, a man named Edward Thornton with white whiskers and a reputation for fairness, called the court to order. The People versus Lavinia Whitmore. Charges of fraud, embezzlement, and murder in the first degree. How does the defendant plead? Lavinia's lead counsel stood. Marcus Webb, 60 years old, silver-haired, expensive suit. Not guilty, Your Honor, on all counts. And so it began. Hutchins built the case methodically, day by day, witness by witness, document by document. He called the banker who had processed the transfers, the contractors who had been paid twice, the families who had been defrauded. He called Dr. Morrison, who admitted under oath that he had falsified medical records at Lavinia's request. The courtroom gasped. The judge called for order. Webb cross-examined each witness with surgical precision, pointed out inconsistencies, suggested alternative explanations, made the jury doubt whether malice was involved or simply poor record-keeping. He was good. Cordelia had to admit that. He was very good. On the 5th day, Hutchins called Cordelia to the stand. She walked to the witness box in a dress of deep gray wool. simple and well made. Her hair was pulled back as always, the birthmark visible as always. She placed her hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. Hutchins began gently. Background questions. Her marriage to Augustus. Her relationship with Lavinia. Her exile to Montana. Then he moved to the evidence. Mrs. Ashford, can you describe what you found when you first examined the estate financial records in Montana? Chaos. Deliberate chaos. Entries that made no sense. Debts that should not have existed. Income that was reported one amount but deposited as another. And what conclusion did you draw from this? That someone had been systematically stealing from the estate while making it look like incompetence. Webb objected. Speculation, Your Honor. I will allow it, Judge Thornton said. The witness is qualified to assess financial records. Hutchins continued. You later found a letter written by your late husband. Can you tell the court about that letter? Cordelia described it. The handwriting, the accusations, the mention of poison. She kept her voice steady, factual. Let the words speak for themselves. And did you find the bottle your husband mentioned? I did. It was among his personal effects. I had kept them unable to dispose of them after his death. Why did you keep the bottle specifically? I do not know. Instinct, perhaps. Some part of me that already suspected. Hutchins presented the bottle as evidence. Then, the chemist's report. Arsenic levels sufficient to cause death over a period of months. The courtroom was silent. Absolutely silent. Webb's cross-examination was brutal. Mrs. Ashford, you claim this bottle contains poison, but you kept it for 7 years before having it tested. How do we know you did not add the arsenic yourself? Why would I do that? To support a fabricated narrative that would give you control of an estate worth millions. The estate was worth nothing when I arrived in Montana. I spent 7 years making it profitable. If I wanted money, I would have sold it and kept the proceeds. Perhaps you wanted more than money. Perhaps you wanted revenge against a woman you felt had wronged you. Cordelia looked at him. Mrs. Whitmore did wrong me. She exiled me. She tried to destroy me. But I do not need revenge, Mr. Webb. I need justice, not just for myself, but for everyone she has victimized. Noble words. But how do we know any of this is true? How do we know you did not fabricate the letter, plant the evidence? Because I am not the one with a history of fraud. That would be your client. The gallery murmured. The judge called for order. Webb tried another angle. You have been working closely with Mr. Sterling Marlowe for several years now. Is that correct? It is. Mr. Marlowe has his own grievances against Mrs. Whitmore. His father's suicide. Is it possible your relationship has colored your judgment, made you see conspiracy where there is only coincidence? Cordelia kept her voice level. Mr. Marlowe provided investigative expertise. The evidence speaks for itself regardless of who discovered it. Does it, or is this elaborate case built on the word of a bitter widow and a vengeful son? Hutchins objected. Counsel is testifying. Sustained, Thornton said. Mr. Webb, ask questions or sit down. Webb tried for another hour, tried to shake her, make her angry, make her seem unreliable. Cordelia answered each question the same way. Calm, direct, letting the facts carry the weight. When she finally stepped down, she felt hollowed out, exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical effort. Marlowe was waiting in the hallway when they broke for the day. You did well. Did I? You did not let him rattle you. That is half the battle. The trial continued for 3 more weeks. More witnesses. More documents. More arguments that went in circles until Cordelia thought she would scream from the tedium. Then on December 18th, Hutchins called his final witness. Marcus Webb looked surprised when his own client's name was announced. Lavinia looked terrified. She took the stand looking smaller than Cordelia had ever seen her. The prosecutor began with simple questions. Background, history, her relationship with the Ashford family. Then he shifted. Mrs. Whitmore, you were married to Jonathan Whitmore from 1842 to 1864. Is that correct? Yes. And Mr. Whitmore died in 1864. Yes, of heart failure. Heart failure. That is interesting because we have obtained medical records from 1864 that show your husband was treated for symptoms consistent with arsenic poisoning. Were you aware of this? Lavinia's hands gripped the edge of the witness box. I was not privy to his medical details. No, even though you were his wife. Even though you were present during his final illness. Many wives are not informed of medical details. It was considered inappropriate. Hutchins smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. Mrs. Whitmore, your husband left you a substantial fortune when he died. Approximately $400,000. Is that correct? I do not recall the exact amount. You do not recall inheriting $400,000. It was a long time ago. Not so long that you would forget that kind of money, unless, of course, you have been handling that kind of money regularly for decades. Webb objected, badgering the witness. Overruled. Answer the question, Mrs. Whitmore. Lavinia's composure was cracking. Cordelia could see it. The same crack she had seen that first day in the courtroom widening now. I managed my late husband's affairs, Lavinia said, as any good wife would. Managed them. Interesting word. Did you also manage his death? The courtroom erupted. Judge Thornton slammed his gavel. Order, Mr. Hutchins, that is inflammatory even for you. I withdraw the question, Your Honor. Let me ask another. Mrs. Whitmore, you were investigated in 1865 for securities fraud involving railroad shares. Do you recall this? Lavinia went pale. I was never charged. No. Because your lawyers made the investigation go away. But we have the records. We have testimony from the investigators. We know what you did, just like we know what you did to Augustus Ashford. just like we know what you have been doing for 40 years. I have done nothing wrong. I have only tried to help people who needed guidance. Help them." Hutchins' voice rose. "You poisoned 2 husbands. You embezzled from 7 families. You destroyed lives and fortunes, and you did it all while wearing pearls and serving tea. That is not help, Mrs. Whitmore. That is murder." "No." The word came out as a whisper, then louder. "No. You do not understand." Jonathan was weak. He would have squandered everything. Augustus was the same. Weak men who needed strong women to manage what they could not handle themselves. The courtroom went silent again, dead silent. Lavinia seemed to realize what she had said. Her hands flew to her mouth, but it was too late. Hutchins leaned forward. Strong women who managed by poisoning their husbands, who they were going to lose everything, Lavinia said. Her voice was shaking now, all the composure gone. Jonathan was making terrible investments. Augustus was too soft-hearted with his business dealings. They needed to be removed before they destroyed what I had built. What you had built with their money. It was my strategy, my planning. They were just figureheads. I made them wealthy. I made their fortunes grow. What right did they have to throw it all away? Webb was on his feet trying to stop her. But Lavinia was not listening. She was staring at Cordelia, and everything she had kept controlled for decades was pouring out. "You," she said, pointing. "You were supposed to disappear. You were supposed to fade away in Montana and die quietly. But you did not. You built something. You proved you were stronger than I thought. Do you know how rare that is? How few women could have done what you did?" "Mrs. Whitmore," Webb said urgently, "stop talking." But she could not stop. The dam had broken. I gave you a chance. I sent you where you could not interfere, where you could not question what I was doing. But you could not accept that. You had to keep pushing, had to keep building, had to prove that you were better than me. Cordelia stood. Hutchins tried to stop her, but she walked toward the witness stand, stopped a few feet away. "I am not better than you," Cordelia said quietly. "I am simply not you. And that is enough." Lavinia looked at her, really looked at her. The birthmark she had used to justify exile. The woman she had tried to destroy. Then Lavinia started laughing, high and broken and terrible. "You won," she said. "Congratulations. You beat me at my own game. I hope you enjoy it." The trial ended 3 days later. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Guilty on all counts. Lavinia was sentenced to life in prison. She was 71 years old. She would never leave. As the marshals led her away, she looked at Cordelia one last time. No hatred in her eyes anymore. Just exhaustion. Just defeat. Cordelia watched her go, felt nothing, no triumph, No satisfaction, just a kind of hollow finality. Outside the courthouse, journalists mobbed her. Questions shouted from all directions. How did it feel to win? What would she do now? Did she forgive Lavinia? Marlowe extracted her from the crowd, got her into a carriage. They rode in silence back to the hotel. "We won," he said finally. "Yes. You do not sound happy about it." "I am not unhappy. I am just tired. So very tired." The legal aftermath took months. The embezzled funds were recovered. $4 million traced through accounts and trusts and investments. Returned to the families Lavinia had defrauded. Cordelia took control of the Ashford estate. All of it. The Montana property, the railroad shares, the investments. Approximately $12 million in total assets. She was one of the wealthiest women in America. The society matrons who had shunned her now sent invitations. She burned them all. In March of 1881, on a cold afternoon with snow threatening Sterling, Marlowe came to her hotel room with a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses. "I have been thinking about your offer," he said. "The job in Montana, yes and no." He poured whiskey into both glasses, handed her one. "I do not want to be your employee, Cordelia, but I would like to be your partner. In business and in life, if you would have me." Cordelia looked at him. This man who had helped her fight, who had believed her when no one else would, who had seen her at her worst and her best and stayed. "I would have you," she said. They married quietly in April. No society wedding, no announcement in the papers. Just a judge in a small office and Mrs. Grant as witness. They returned to Montana as husband and wife. Lavinia died in prison in the summer of 1885. Pneumonia, the warden's letter said. She was 73 years old. Cordelia received the news while checking the irrigation flow in the eastern fields. She stood in the sun, reading the letter twice. Then she folded it and put it in her pocket and went back to work. The Ashford estate thrived. The irrigation system transformed thousands of acres. The cattle operation expanded. The timber business grew. Cordelia built a reputation as a ruthless but fair businesswoman. Men who tried to cheat her learned quickly not to try again. She also built Thornfield Technical Institute for Women. Started in 1883 with 20 students in a converted barn. By 1890, it had 200 students a year in a proper building with dormitories and laboratories. Young women came from all over the country to learn engineering, agriculture, business management. Everything the world told them they could not do. Cordelia taught some of the classes herself, showed them her notebooks, the system she had developed for tracking soil composition and water flow, the accounting methods she had created to manage complex holdings. She told them about Lavinia, too, not as a villain, but as a warning, about what happens when intelligence and ambition are channeled into destruction instead of creation. In October of 1883, Cordelia gave birth to a son, Thaddeus. He had Sterling's dark hair and Cordelia's amber eyes. No birthmark, healthy and strong and loud. In June of 1886, a daughter, Isolde, she had the birthmark, the same port wine stain running down her right cheek that Cordelia had. Cordelia held her daughter and cried, not from disappointment, but from fierce, protective love. Her daughter would not grow up ashamed of that mark. Her daughter would grow up knowing it was just skin, just coloring, nothing that mattered compared to what was inside. Now in the autumn of 1894, Cordelia stood on the porch of the main house and watched her children play in the yard. Thaddeus was 11 already, showing an interest in the engineering aspects of the ranch. Isolde was 8, fearless and curious, and completely unbothered by the birthmark that occasionally made strangers stare. Sterling came out to join her. He was 58 now. The limp was more pronounced on cold days. The silver in his hair had overtaken the dark, but his eyes were still sharp, still saw her clearly. "Thinking about the old days?" he asked. "Thinking about how strange it is that exile was the best thing that ever happened to me. Strange how things work out. Lavinia wanted to bury me. Instead, she planted me." Sterling smiled. "That is poetic." "It is true." They watched Isolde chase her brother around the oak tree that Cordelia had planted 20 years ago. It was 30 feet tall now, strong and spreading. "Do you ever regret it?" Sterling asked. "The fight, the trial, all of it?" Cordelia considered. "No. It needed to happen. Not just for me, but for everyone she hurt. Justice delayed is not justice denied, but it is diminished. We gave those families their reckoning while they could still see it. Your father would be proud of you." "My father never knew what to make of me, but Augustus would be proud. I think that is what matters." A carriage was coming up the drive. Cordelia recognized it as belonging to the president of Columbia University. They had been in correspondence about a lecture series, Women in Agriculture and Business. Cordelia had agreed to give the inaugural address. "More visitors wanting your wisdom," Sterling said. "They do not want wisdom. They want novelty. A woman who built something despite everything designed to stop her. Makes for good theater. Let them have their theater. You have earned the right to tell your story however you want." The children ran up onto the porch, breathless and laughing. Isolde had grass stains on her dress. Thaddeus had lost a shoe somewhere. "Mother Professor Whitman is here," Thaddeus said. Cordelia looked at Sterling. "Will you entertain him while I make myself presentable? I will tell him about the new irrigation expansion. That should bore him sufficiently." She went inside, climbed the stairs to the bedroom she shared with Sterling, changed into something suitable for receiving academic visitors. As she buttoned her dress, she caught sight of herself in the mirror. 50 years old. Hair more gray than brown now. Lines around her eyes from squinting into sun. The birthmark still there, faded slightly, but permanent. She looked like a woman who had lived, who had fought, who had won. She looked like herself. Downstairs, Professor Whitman was enthusiastically discussing the merits of drip irrigation with Sterling. He stood when Cordelia entered, bowed slightly. "Mrs. Marlowe, thank you for receiving me. I know you are busy." "Never too busy for education, Professor. Would you like to see the school?" They walked across the property to the Institute. 2 buildings now, a third under construction. 200 students this year. Applications coming from as far away as Boston and Atlanta. Young women in work dresses and boots learning to survey land, learning to read geological reports, learning that the world was wider than the parlors they had been expected to inhabit. One of them, a girl of perhaps 19, was explaining soil pH to a younger student, using terms Cordelia had developed, teaching the next generation what this generation had learned. Cordelia watched and felt something settle in her chest. Not satisfaction exactly, something deeper. Legacy. This would continue after she was gone. These women would build things, would fight things, would refuse to be buried. That night, after the professor had left and the children were in bed, Cordelia sat at her desk in the office, the same desk where she had planned the irrigation system, where she had built the case against Lavinia, where she had created everything that came after. Sterling came in with tea, set a cup beside her. "Writing your memoirs, thinking about it. The university wants me to. They think it would be instructive for their students. Will you? Maybe. But I will not make myself the hero. I was angry and desperate and lucky. That is not heroism. You were also brilliant and determined and willing to do what needed doing. That is heroism." Cordelia smiled. "You are biased." "Absolutely. Does not make me wrong." She looked out the window at the valley, at the land that had been her exile and her salvation, at the lights of the Institute burning late as students worked on projects. "Do you know what I learned from all of this?" she said. "From Lavinia and the trial and everything that came after. What? That being discarded is not the end. Sometimes it is permission. Permission to become something that the people who discarded you never imagined possible." Sterling was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That should be the first line of your memoir." "Perhaps it will be." Isolde appeared in the doorway in her nightgown holding a book. "Mother, I cannot sleep. Will you read to me?" Cordelia stood, took her daughter's hand. The same hand that bore the same mark Cordelia had carried all her life. "Of course. What story tonight?" "The one about the woman who turned the desert into a garden." "That is a good one." They walked upstairs together. Cordelia read the story while Isolde's eyes grew heavy. When she finally slept, Cordelia sat beside her bed for a moment longer, watching her daughter breathe, watching the birthmark rise and fall with each breath. This child would never apologize for existing, would never make herself smaller, would never believe that other people's discomfort was her responsibility to manage. That was victory. More than the trial, more than the empire, more than any of it. Cordelia went back downstairs. Sterling had fallen asleep in his chair, papers scattered across his lap. She covered him with a blanket, left him there rather than wake him. She stepped out onto the porch. The autumn air was cold. Stars were scattered across a sky so vast it seemed impossible that it was the same sky that hung over New York. Same stars, different perspective. In the distance, a coyote howled. Another answered. The sounds of a wilderness that was less wild now, but still present. Still here. Cordelia wrapped her shawl tighter. Thought about the woman who had arrived here 21 years ago, broken and bleeding and convinced she had lost everything that mattered. That woman had been wrong. She had not lost everything. She had lost the things that never mattered in the first place. The approval of people who valued surfaces over substance. The security of being taken care of rather than being capable. The comfort of never being tested. In exchange, she had gained herself. The true version. The one that could build and fight and endure. The one that did not need anyone's permission to exist. Cordelia stood on the porch until the cold became too much. Then she went inside, locked the door, climbed the stairs to bed. Tomorrow would bring more work, more challenges, more of the endless tasks required to maintain what had been built and to build more. But tonight she slept, deep and dreamless and unafraid, because she had learned the most important lesson exile had to teach, that the only person who could truly bury you was yourself. And she had refused. Refused then. Refused now. Would refuse tomorrow and every day after. They had tried to write her ending, had sent her to Montana to disappear, to fade, to become nothing. Instead, she had written her own story, one that would outlast all of them, one that young women in work boots would read 100 years from now and recognize, the story of someone who was discarded, and decided that being unwanted was not the same as being worthless. That refusal, that simple, stubborn refusal to accept someone else's assessment of her value, had changed everything. It had built an empire. It had created a legacy. It had saved lives she would never meet. And it had proven beyond any doubt that the woman New York society deemed inconvenient was actually the most dangerous kind of woman there was. The kind who knew her own worth and refused to negotiate it. Cordelia closed her eyes, let sleep take her. And somewhere in the Montana darkness, the land she had transformed kept growing. Kept producing, kept proving that what others called wasteland was actually possibility waiting for someone brave enough to see it.